In this third video, I will show you how to create source data for the timeline and link it dynamically to timeline parameters, timescale, and intervals display. We need 8 weeks of source data for timescale and interval dates. First 4 weeks of data for a standard-sized timeline, and the remaining for extending it at a later date if required. Link first source data cell to the start date. Select the cell, enter =, in the formula bar, and then click on Start Date cell. Go to Home tab and format cell with options specified here in this text box. Link the next cell to the first data cell. Select the cell, enter =, in the formula bar, click on the first cell, and type +1. Format the cell with Format Painter. Select the first cell, click on Format Painter, and then apply format by clicking on the second cell. While the second data cell is selected, drag the fill handle across to fill the next 5 cells. Move to next row, and link its first cell to the last one in the first row, and enter +1. Link the next cell to the first data cell, and enter +1. While the data cell is selected, drag the fill handle across to fill the next 5 cells. Finally, select all cells in the second row, and drag the fill handle down to fill cells in the rows for the next 6 weeks. Now, source data, dynamically linked to the start date, has been created for timescale and interval dates. In this next stage, the source data, already linked to the start date, will also be dynamically linked to the timescale elements. Copy and paste timescale element created earlier, and link it to the first source data cell. Select the element shape, enter =, in the formula bar, and then click on the first data cell. Now, the timescale element and the data cell are dynamically linked directly. As a result, the timescale element is also dynamically linked to the start date indirectly. So, whenever the start date is changed, the timescale element date will be updated accordingly. Duplicate the timescale element to make copies for the whole week. Select the shape, hold down the Ctrl key, and keep pressing D on the keyboard until all the copies are made. Select all 7 shapes by using Select Objects cursor. After selecting a shape, go to Find and Select on the Home tab, and click on Select Objects. Then draw a box over the elements to select them. As Select Objects cursor will be used frequently, I have added the cursor to the Quick Access toolbar. While the shapes are selected, go to Align command in the Format tab. First align the shapes to the top, and then distribute them horizontally. After this, link each shape to its respective data cell, just as the first shape was linked. Select all 7 timescale shapes by using Select Objects cursor. Copy the selected shapes and paste onto a cell with same address in a new workbook. Arrange the workbooks vertically. Locate the cell linked to the shape, and type in any number or character. Similarly, fill in the next 6 cells in this row. Select the cells, and drag them over to the next row. Timescale element links to cells on this row will also be updated as a result. Copy and paste the elements with updated links back into Data Worksheet. Now, instead of the cells, for the first week, the pasted elements are dynamically linked to the cells for the second week. Select these cells and drag them over to the next row, again. And then copy and paste the elements back into Data Worksheet. Repeat the process for the next week, and continue until shapes for all subsequent weeks are dynamically linked to the data cells. Rearrange shapes for the first 4 weeks to make a time scale for the timeline. As you can see in this demonstration, new time scale has been linked dynamically to the start date. On each interval, a date range and week number are displayed. The display is derived from this data and is dynamically linked to start date through the data. To display the date range, interval start and end dates are first converted to text by using the text function, then joined together to form a text string, which eventually is linked to the interval shape. For example, to convert start date for the first interval, open Function dialog box by clicking on Insert Function button in the Formula bar, or in the Function Library group on Formulas tab. Type text in the search box, and then double-click on the text function. Move cursor into Value box, and click on the start date. Then move cursor into Format text box, and type in the format for start date. And click on OK. Similarly, convert interval end date to text. Then select these cells, and drag the fill handle down to convert dates for all other intervals to text. For week numbers display, just type in the week numbers from 1 to 8. Make sure all cells have the general format. Now the dates and week numbers are in text form, they can be joined into a text string. Text in the cells can be joined by adding ampersand between each cell. Select the cell where joined text will appear. Enter equal sign in the formula bar, click on the first cell with text, press Shift 7 to add ampersand, and then click on the next cell with the text. Add another ampersand before clicking the third cell with text string to be joined. To display this hyphen, enclose it in double quotation marks with space on either side of the character. Type ampersand before this text string. And then, add the whole string between the first and second cell address in the formula. Display text for week as text string before the number in the same way. To move week number to the second row, use char function. Add another ampersand followed by the char function before the week string in this formula. To create display for another 7 weeks, click on this cell and drag the fill handle down. Duplicate the interval shape to make copies for another 7 weeks. First arrange the interval shapes horizontally and then distribute vertically before linking them to their respective cells in this range. Intervals display, option 2. In this option, intervals date display method is same as for option 1, but weeks display method is different. It allows greater control over weeks count display in timeline intervals. You can skip it if option 1 satisfactorily meets your timeline needs. Weeks count is fixed in option 1. But it is variable in this option. It can display any of these 3 number sequences depending upon values in weeks count and planned duration cells. When 1 is entered into weeks count cell, first sequence derived from annual week numbers is selected. But when 0 is entered into this cell, the second sequence, based on plan start date, is selected. And when plan duration is also specified, the third sequence is selected, which restarts whenever a new plan begins. Annual week numbers sequence can be created from start date for each interval by using weekNum function. Select the cell where week number will be displayed, click on Insert Function button, type weekNum in the search box, and then double-click on weekNum. Move cursor into serial number box, and click on the start date. Now, Move cursor into return type box, type in 2. This number determines on which day the week begins. When 2 is entered, week begins on Monday. And then click on OK. Select the cell, and drag the fill handle down to display week numbers for all other start dates. This will work perfectly as annual week numbers sequence. However, this sequence is interrupted when some start dates extend into the next year. As it will also form basis for the other two sequences, it must be continuous. This problem can be overcome by using the if function to add 52 to the week number whenever a start date falls into next year. We also need to use the year function so that the if function can distinguish between dates for the first and second year. Select the cell where start date year will be displayed, type $, followed by year in the formula bar, and double-click on year. Then click on the start date, and press enter. In the next cell, enter a formula which will return 0 if the date belongs to the first year, or 1 if it belongs to the second year. Select the cell, and in the formula bar, enter $, and type in Y. Double-click on the year function from the pop-up list. Select the start date, press minus, and then select the year cell. Convert the year cell address in the formula to absolute address by pressing F4 after selecting it. Make sure both year and tag cells have general format. Select the cells and drag the fill handle to display the year tag for all start dates. As you can see, the formula returns 1 when the date belongs to the following year, otherwise, it returns 0. Now we can use the if function that will add 52 to a week number when its date belongs to the following year. Select another cell. For week number, display, enter $, in the formula bar, type, if, select the tag cell, and press equal. The if function will check the tag cell. If it contains 0, then just the week number for start date will be displayed. Otherwise, 52 will be added to the week number before it is displayed. Not all years have 52 weeks, so this formula will not give correct sequence when a year has 53 weeks. For instance, when start date is changed to 12th of December 2017, 53 appears twice in the sequence. This happens when week number for first week of the following year begins at 1 instead of 2. We need to modify the formula so that 53 is added to the week number in such a case. To deal with this, add a formula in this cell with match function to spot when week number for first week of the following year begins at 1 in this column, and in this cell, add a formula with the if function that will return 52 or 53 depending upon the result in the above cell. Select this cell, enter $, in the formula bar, type in match. Enter 1 for lookup value. Select the lookup range and enter 0 for match type. Then alter the formula to also add if error function so that when there is no match, false is displayed in the cell. And in this cell, enter the formula with if function. Enter $, type in if, select this cell. The if function will check the cell If it contains false, the function will return 52. Otherwise 53. Now all we need to do is to modify this formula by replacing 52 with this cell address. Copy this formula, paste it into cell on the next column, and modify the formula. Convert the cell address from relative to absolute. Select the cell and drag the fill handle to copy its formula to other cells in the column. A sequence based on plan start date starting at 1 will be created next. This sequence can be derived from the first sequence in this column by subtracting week number for plan start date from week number for each interval start date in this column. Select the first cell, enter equal sign, and then click on cell with week number for the first interval. Enter week num function, click on cell with plan start date, and then convert the cell address to absolute from relative. Select this cell and drag the fill handle to copy the formula into other cells in this column. To start this sequence at 1 instead of 0, add 1 to the first week number in the formula. And finally, the third sequence, that also has to start at 1, but must restart whenever the next plan begins. The sequence will be restarted by making use of the mod function. This function returns the remainder after a number is divided by a divisor. Enter the mod function in this cell. Select this cell for the number and plan duration cell for divisor. To make sure the formula continues to work, when plan duration is set to 0, add if function to the formula too. Then copy the formula into the remaining cells, after converting second cell address from relative to absolute. In this cell, enter formula with if function that will return plan duration number whenever a cell in this column contains 0. Select the cell, type in if. Select this first cell, press equal sign, and type 0. If function will check this cell for 0. And if it contains 0, number in plan duration cell will be returned. Otherwise number in this cell will be returned. Now, we can test this sequence to see if it will restart correctly whenever the plan duration is changed. When plan duration is 4 weeks, sequence restarts after the 4th week. And when it is changed to 5 weeks, sequence restarts after the 5th week. Similarly, when it is changed to 6 weeks, sequence restarts after the 6th week. If function in its compound form, will be added to cells in this column, so that the column can display any of these three number sequences. Depending upon values in weeks count and planned duration cells. Select the first cell in this column. After typing if, enter the word and. If function will check weeks count and planned duration cells. If both are equal to 0, value from cell in sequence 2 column will be returned. Otherwise, nested if function will check weeks count cell, and if it contains 0, value from cell in sequence 3 column will be returned. But if the cell does not contain 0, value from cell in sequence 1 column will be returned. In other words, when 1 is entered into weeks count cell, first sequence is selected. But when 0 is entered into this cell, the second sequence is selected. And when planned duration is also specified, the third sequence is selected. Now we have source data for the timeline that is dynamically linked to timeline parameters, timescale, and intervals. Shapes for the timeline have also been created earlier. In the next and final video, all these will be brought together to build up the timeline.